Welcome back to RealClearPolitics on Sirius XM. I'm Philip Wegmann, White House reporter for RCP, and I'm joined now by Neera Tanden, the president and CEO of the Center for American Progress, who has worked in each of the last three Democratic presidential administrations, most recently as a domestic policy advisor to President Biden. Neera, thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
So you laid out a plan for how you believe Democrats can win on immigration in this recent Wall Street Journal op-ed. And you wrote that our proposal would secure the border and the misuse of asylum and admit more legal immigrants. So to start, how do you define border security?
Well, fundamentally, I think border security means the border is not porous for people to come across, really without legal means. So that means, in terms of how we define border security in the plan, we define it as the border is secure. We're not attracting people to cross the border. And one of the big challenges with the asylum system that really did grow up over many, many years is by saying that people had a right to come to the border and claim asylum anywhere on the border. That system really developed to ensure that it could attract people to the border in between ports of entry. And one of the real challenges of that is that when the border got overwhelmed, as it did in a variety of times, many times during the Biden administration, but also during the Trump administration,
Mhm.
then, people would get notices to appear, and there was an incredible backlog in the court system. So essentially, the asylum system was misused to create like more chaos at the border, and that's a real problem we have to solve going forward.
So ideally, the number of illegal border crossings, if you're able to get security there at the southern border, as well as reform the asylum system, should be, in an ideal world, close to zero.
Yes, we should not have people crossing the border illegally between ports of entry. Our plan really does move the asylum process to ports of entry where people can have there can be an orderly system. And most fundamentally, we reform the asylum system so that essentially, asylum is really for its original purpose. The original
Mm,
purposes of the asylum laws was to protect people from persecution,
mhm.
persecution by a government, often an authoritarian government that targets people for who they are, their political beliefs, their religious beliefs, their minority status. And we fundamentally want to reform the asylum system and the abuse of asylum practices and ensure that we are really only allowing people in through the asylum process who deserve to come into the United
Yeah.
States. Now, we expand legal immigration because we also believe what's broken in the immigration system is that we've had, 15-year, 20-year backlogs of green cards.
Mhm.
Fundamentally, we should have an immigration system that is designed to have our country grow, our economy grow, and that's part of our plan as well.
I want to get your reaction to something that President Trump said during his first address to Congress earlier this year. He said, quote, "The Democratic Party kept saying we needed new legislation to secure the border, but it turns out that all we really needed was a new president." That's what he
Mhm.
told Congress in March. A month before, according to DHS, border apprehensions hit a 15-year low. So take up that argument. Why was Trump able to secure the border when President Biden was not?
Well, like factually, President Biden issued an executive order in June of last year that dropped border entries down below 1,000 per day. They spiked up a little bit before the election, I think because of concerns about President Trump, but those numbers went down from 11,000, 10,000 a day, 9,000, 6,000 to under 1,000. And so there was a dramatic change. I think one can legitimately wonder why that didn't happen earlier in the administration. I recognize that that's a real problem, and that's one of the reasons why we put forward this plan. But I think this fact is really a fascinating one. That I do think that President Trump has essentially closed down the border. We don't really have even legitimate asylum claims coming through the border. But what we're really making the case around is that it's actually a false choice to say that you need to take on some of the tactics of this administration. Tactics like ripping away temporary protective status to people who've been here 20 or 30 years, They lose their legal status so that they can be deported to countries like Nicaragua
Mhm.
that we actually provided protective status because that country was an authoritarian. It was an authoritarian, a left-wing authoritarian country. So I think the real challenge here is we should secure the border. But the point we're making in this plan is you can secure the border permanently, not through executive action, through legal action, which will mean it is secure regardless of what administration. And you don't actually have to rip away legal status, deport people who have been here legally, and I just say, frankly, terrorize immigrants, Venezuelans who came here through legal means, sending them to El Salvador and gulags to honestly face brutality. Let's just be clear. People have
So
expressed, I do not think any of those tactics are necessary to secure the border.
certainly, and we should discuss those here in a moment. But you mentioned the executive order that came at the tail end of
Hmm.
President Biden's time in office. You were there as a domestic policy advisor for the last 2 years, and you were
Hmm.
staff secretary previously. What can you tell us about why that decision wasn't made previously? Why did it have to take until something like 10 million border apprehensions? We're talking about roughly the state of North Carolina.
Hmm.
Why was there such a delay?
So the president did engage in a process with President Biden engaged in a process where he was trying to get legislation passed with Republicans. There was a bipartisan effort. We debated taking executive action. We thought that getting a legislative solution would be much more permanent and would be more impervious to the courts. There were concerns from DOJ that executive action could be pulled down, could be held
Mhm.
unconstitutional by the courts, and that legislative action would be a permanent, not a more permanent, a permanent fix. As you know, the president engaged in bipartisan negotiations with the
Trump blew
Congress,
that up, yes.
and then that was blown up by President Trump, and then after that, we did take executive action, and thankfully, the courts did not overturn it, and it was able to have real impact that Donald Trump has definitely uh, built upon. But I think my experience, and I believe we should have acted sooner, given everything that's happened. We should have acted sooner, and I say that in the op-ed in the Wall Street in my op-ed in the Wall Street Journal. But I think that we should also be clear that to have a permanent fix to the border, and one in which you can have a fix without terrorizing people who've been here for decades. We should adopt a comprehensive plan to fix immigration, which addresses asylum and the abuse of the asylum system, but also expands not just contracts, but expands legal
And
immigration.
that's going to require congressional action. I want you to address some of the criticism, though, when it
Mhm.
comes to the credibility that Democrats have
Mhm.
on this issue. I remember the very first question I asked President Biden in 2021 is if there was a crisis at the border. He said
Mhm.
no. And then the Biden administration continued to say no for the majority of those 4 years. Even in December of 2023, when border apprehensions, monthly apprehensions were spiking more than 300,000. So why should the public trust Democrats on border security now, in relation to all of those other immigration fixes that you've mentioned, asylum and visas? But when Biden seemed to refuse to acknowledge the problem in those early days.
Yeah, I mean, I think the reason why people should trust Democrats is they should really look at the plan and look at look at what we're proposing. And I totally take this point, but I think the idea here is that we are offering an actual fix. A true fix to asylum takes to the asylum challenge takes legislation. The reason why that is, it is in legislation that people can come to the border and claim asylum. So if we want to have a permanent fix, it takes an actual plan to do that and a proposal. And I think the real challenge during the Biden administration is that it was hard to imagine 60 votes for an immigration plan that fixed a lot of this problem. And you are absolutely right. We can get into semantics about the past and
Mhm.
discuss like whether it was a crisis at one point or not. I'm here to just say I fully understand that it was a crisis, and I think that we have to solve this problem but there are many problems in the immigration system.
Mhm.
There is a problem. There has been a problem at the border. There is also a problem that it takes 15 years to get to address the backlogs in green cards, and that is also a problem in our immigration system, and we should fix that problem as well. And we
Yeah.
fundamentally believe that to get trust on immigration, Democrats are going to have to offer solutions that actually fix the problem.
So this is a counterfactual, but you did raise this point in your op-ed,
Mhm.
and I'm curious. You know that the failure to confront the situation at the border in 2021 and 2022 contributed not just to Trump's reelection, but it ushered in his immigration policies.
Mhm.
Do you think that if President Biden had moved sooner on the border, do you believe that he would still be president, or perhaps Kamala Harris?
I actually don't know. I don't know if this was the key factor or there are other factors. Inflation, I can't say that this is the seminal factor. I guess my view of this issue is that fundamentally we have to fix these problems
Mm.
going forward.
Yeah.
And
So
as we look to the future and we look to what future candidates should do, my view is that, and the view behind this plan is that we have to ensure that we are fixing the border, we are fixing immigration. And honestly, you know, I think we can relitigate back and forth the past, but
mhm.
we have immigration policies today. And those
Yeah,
policies
focusing.
today are behind an institution called, you know, alligator Alcatraz. They are behind the fact that ICE is now rounding up grandmothers from across the country. They are behind
Mm,
policies which are trying to target immigrants, many of whom have been here for decades, paying
yeah.
taxes, contributing. And one of the reasons we put forward our plan is because we know that it is actually a false choice, that we have to round up grandmothers who've been here 20 years in order to have a secure border.
I'm glad
You can have a secure
yeah.
border without doing any of these things.
I'm glad you raised Alligator Alcatraz. We were there recently and we interviewed Florida Governor Ron DeSantis outside of the facility. We were
Mhm.
not allowed in, but I want to get your reaction to something that he told me last week. He said, quote, "It can't be a one-way ratchet where they get to let in 10 million. And then somehow when Americans want that remedied, the American people are not entitled to see those 10 million brought back to their own country."
Mhm.
What do you make of that sentiment from DeSantis, one of these governors who's exporting a state model for deportations?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'd just ask you why you weren't allowed into Alligator Alcatraz. Like, do you
Yeah,
not think that's a little odd that you
we
weren't
pressed the
allowed
governor.
into
We certainly
Alligator?
pressed him so that they've made these claims that it exceeds all standards. Those are claims as of yet. Right now, though, we have not been allowed inside of the facility. The governor said that he was open to it at some point, but as of right now, we haven't. So I take your point, and I was also frustrated we weren't allowed inside. But react to that sentiment from the governor.
Yeah, I guess I would say this. If you have a person who has crossed the border illegally, we should absolutely repatriate them. I think what we are seeing in some of the tactics that have been deployed is that there really is an effort to, scare and intimidate people. And the fact that that the policies of this administration have led to a situation where the government has picked up people who are legally here, who came here through legal processes, and sent them to an El Salvadoran gulag in prison, an El Salvadorian prison that does really feel like a gulag where they have experienced, you know, torture. I think that that is really wrong. And I think if you have an institution called, um, something akin to Alligator Alcatraz, that is much more about terrorizing people. And I guess my view is that we can have an immigration policy that lives up to our values, that is tough on the border, and that does not require the terrorizing of people, the intimidation of people, the essential assault on human dignity of people in order to secure the border. And that is really
Mhm.
one of the points of our plan.
Yeah, you call for a path to citizenship for some who have been here. I believe your words were decades in the Wall Street Journal op-ed.
Hmm.
The Center for American Progress put out this report in 2013 that described a pathway to citizenship as, quote, the only way to maintain electoral strength in the future. You can probably expect the Republican criticism here, but what do you say to those Republicans, Donald Trump being one of them during the second debate with Kamala Harris, who responded that a pathway to citizenship, what they would describe as amnesty, is just meant to solidify Democratic majorities?
I mean, I think this whole debate is really outdated, right? Because, first of all, Republicans have been doing relatively well with Latinos. They actually did really well with recent immigrant
Mm,
voters in the last election. And I think the American public actually supports a path to citizenship for people who've been here again a decade or longer. That's our plan. That's what we call for in this plan. And I don't know what you're referring to in terms of electoral strength, and I will definitely go look at that because our our plan to provide a path to citizenship is really fundamentally not about voting or election changes or anything like that. It is fundamentally about this. People who've been here for 10 years or longer, who have contributed to our economy, who have paid taxes, who will have who have to learn English, who have to pay back fines, people recognize that they have been contributing and in some ways have been demonstrating their desire to be Americans. And we are a country of immigrants that have had people who have come and become citizens in shorter amounts of time in our history. And so that is really what's animating this. And I think fundamentally, I think is wrong to think, and it's really old thinking to think those people will be Republicans or Democrats or independents. We do not know what they will be. Again, recent immigrant arrivals who can vote voted, I think for Trump by 14 points. And so that is how this electoral strength has nothing to do with it, and I actually think a lot of Republicans would recognize that today.
It was a piece by Philip Woolgan, the former managing
Mm,
director of immigration policy. But your point is well taken about the recent shift that we've seen, and certainly all of us will be keeping a close eye on that. I know your time is limited. I do want to get one final question in here before you go. Thank you for joining us. But you did serve for 4 years in the
mhm,
Biden White House, first as staff secretary and then domestic policy advisor. And there's been some debate over your recent testimony before the House Oversight Committee. The
mhm.
Republican majority, they say that you directed autopen signatures without knowing who gave the final approval. The Democratic minority, they call that a lie. So, did you receive written sign off from President Biden each time you used the autopen?
Yes. Every time I use the autopen to execute executive actions, there's an autopen used for letters to, just from the public, but whenever, every single time I use the autopen to to authorize, and I didn't use it, a career official did, but when I authorized the use of the auto pen, I had the president's signature, and sometimes detailed notes on each and every time. And so, you know, when I was testifying, Chairman Comer said that I was very forthcoming. So I found it very disappointing that the committee afterwards, I believe, really misled the public by
Mhm.
saying that it wasn't clear we got authorization. I followed the same protocol every staff secretary, I believe both Republican and Democrat, had used before me, and that was to get a president's signature and I got it twice. I had a very formal process for using it. So, I think there's been a lot of I'm really glad to clarify this here because there's been a lot of misinformation about the use of the AutoPen. Every time I authorized its use, President Biden had signed off himself.
Very good. Well, we will have to leave it there. Neera, thank you so much for joining us. You're listening to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM. Stay with us. We'll have more right after the break.